Right. So historian Tabitha Stanmore observed that in one form or another, magic is constant in all societies across the world and throughout time. The fact of its existence is never a novelty. As Dr. D. Michael Quinn and others have demonstrated, magic is unquestionably present within the Mormon past. Rather than fearing magic as somehow at odds with the religious claims of Joseph Smith Jr. and his family, we should consider it as one of the many lenses by which we can better understand the Mormon restoration writ large. The Holiness of the Lord Parchment, passed down through the descendants of Hiram Smith, is an important vehicle to this understanding. After LDS patriarch Eldred G. Smith began to publicly exhibit the Smith family's three magical parchments in 1979, they soon began to attract study. Initially, they were believed to be Masonic in nature, an assumption refuted by Arturo de Hoyos, the Grand Archivist of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. A more thorough analysis appeared 5 years later. In Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, Quinn and his successors have added to our understanding, primarily by finding parallels in various historical documents, but they've also suffered from a lack of context. Just as the intersection of Freemasonry and Mormonism was occluded for many years due to researchers who were only familiar with one tradition or the other, scholarship on the Smith family parchment has lost this perspective of practicing ceremonial magicians. When Quinn's work was first published, I was inspired to seek out some of the primary sources, including magical grimoires. I found the material intriguing, but also vague, confusing, overwhelming. Years later, after gaining my own experience as a practicing magician, these books suddenly emerge as if from a dense fog. I soon realized that they are written by practitioners for practitioners, assuming a level of context and experience that outsiders would never fully grasp. My intention today is to bring this experience to the Smith family Holiness of the Lord parchment. Unlike the other two charms handed down with it, the Holiness of the Lord parchment is more properly referred to as a lamen. So what is a lamen? Well, a lamen, not to be confused with nor pronounced like layman in the Book of Mormon, is a sacred image or chart typically made on metal, but perfumed or wax tablets, or pure white paper with convenient colors, and used for the purpose of ritually invoking one or more spirits. The elements and arrangements of the Smith family lamen demonstrate, as I'll explain, that it was carefully constructed to invoke a good spirit and protect the wearer from temptations. The classic source for describing the construction of a lamen is Pseudo-Agrippa's 1559 fourth book of philosophy. But much of Pseudo-Agrippa's work was directly reproduced in 1801 by Francis Barrett in the Magus. Copies of the Magus made their way around the world, including the United States, where it provided the template for Joseph Smith's Jupiter talisman. As noted by Quinn and others, a direct connection to the Smith family can be drawn here and is established by the fact that the Jupiter talisman produced a very specific printing error from the Magus. According to the Magus, a lamen may be square, circular, or triangular, or of the like sort. In its center, the magician should draw a six-cornered figure containing the name of either a star or a governing spirit who holds authority over the spirit the magician wishes to invoke. In the outer corners of the lamen, the magician should draw a minimum of 4 pentagrams, or more depending on the number of spirits being invoked. Additional details of the lamen would depend on the particular nature of these spirits. Various images called seals or pentacles were a vital part of the lamen, to the point that the magicians frequently referred to their lamens as sacred pentacles. According to the Magus, these pentacles are certain holy signs and characters, preserving us from evil chances and events, helping and assisting us to bind, exterminate, and drive away evil spirits, alluring good spirits, and reconciling them to us. These pentacles consist of either characters of good spirits of the superior order, or of sacred pictures of holy letters or revelations, with apt and proper versicles, which are composed either of geometrical figures and holy names of God, according to the course and manner of the many of them, or they are compounded of all of them, or many of them mixed. As a general matter, these images were to be surrounded by a double border containing the name of the angel, one or more divine names, or a scriptural reference related to the lamen's desired effects. The Smith family lamen follows these basic conditions, beginning with various protective pentacles or seals. First, it contains a talisman that was readily available in the popular 1825 book, The Astrologer of the 19th Century by Robert Cross Smith, writing under the pseudonym of Raphael. This talisman promised that he that beareth this sign about him shall be helped in every need and necessity. Second, the lamen contained a seal of the earth from Ebenezer Sibley's 1790 new and complete illustration of the celestial sciences, promising that whosoever beareth this sign need fear no foe. Third, the lamen included a polygonal figure which contained the great character and the greatest character illustrated by Sibley. The Smith version contained the divine name's tetragrammaton, made up of syllables written in the external points of the figure, and Adonai written in the center. Fourth, the Smith family included sigils from the Sibleys representing the angel Polypa and Nalga, both of which were intended to uplift the mind of the wearer and protect them against various threats posed by evil spirits, such as witchcraft and sexual temptations. Next, the double border of the Smith family lamen contained two key elements. First, a versicle or short biblical passage of importance was written 3 times, as in the case, Holiness of the Lord. Second, the tetragrammaton motif was written in the form of its standard 4 Hebrew letters, Yod He Vav He, repeated 3 times across the bottom. This border, with its scriptural references and divine names, served as a container and bound for the lamen, much like a magic circle. The lamen also contained elements designed to attract good spirits, which the magician wished to conjure. Another seal, also from Sibley, promised that whosoever beareth this seal, all spirits shall do him homage. At the center of the lamen was a 12-pointed star, an innovation from the 6-pointed star specified in the Magus, containing the name Raphael. This would indicate that the Smith family lamen was specifically intended to invoke a spirit that was subject to the governance of the archangel Raphael. Segments of the Raphael star contained additional spirit and divine names written in Hebrew. Notably, every one of these names appeared in a chart of planetary correspondences within the Magus. The Smith family lamen was intricately constructed using standard magical books of the time for the purpose of guarding against evil spirits and invoking a good spirit. Its alignment with spirit invocation practices of the time set it apart as from the 2 other Smith parchments, which were just mere charms. The perspective of a practicing ceremonial magician, therefore, clarifies aspects of the lamen which have not previously been well understood. So, astrology or something else going on here? While the Smith family lamen was dominated by powerful magical symbols, a careful examination shows more subtle details. For example, all of the symbols of the zodiac and the known planets were present. The immediate temptation is to assume this arrangement is a nativity chart, reflecting the positions of the planets at the time of a significant birth or a momentous event. If this was true, we could reverse engineer the date referred to in the lamen by starting with the positions of the outer planets. In this case, Saturn appears opposite of Uranus. Uranus is in Cancer, while Saturn is in Sagittarius. Within the decades surrounding the Mormon Restoration, these conditions were only met between July 13th, 1781 and January 12th of 1782. This rules out reference to any event, since we think of the Restoration beginning with Joseph Smith's 1820 religious pondering. The range does, however, fit the birth date of a figure related to Mormonism's founding. John Smith, uncle of Joseph Smith, was born on July 16, 1781, just 3 days into the required alignment. Now, these implications would be intriguing, possibly even requiring a revision to the lamen's traditional provenance. The lamen was allegedly preserved by Mary Fielding Smith, the wife of Hiram Smith, who passed it on to their son John Smith, and thence down through the Latter-day Saint patriarchal office. Before young John Smith came of age, however, Uncle John Smith served as LDS Church patriarch. If the Smith family lamen contains a nativity chart for Uncle John Smith, then it would likely have originated with him rather than with Hiram. As an alternate possibility, the lamen could portray a horary chart. When a client brought a question to an astrologer, the latter would take a note of the exact time and cast a chart for that precise moment. Based on the positions of the planet and the zodiac signs, the astrologer would then provide a divinatory answer. If the Laman portrayed a horary chart, it would have been in the last half of 1781 or the beginning days of 1782, making it completely unrelated to the Mormon restoration. There are, however, serious problems with both of these hypotheses. Neither a nativity chart nor a horary chart would include a double representation of Saturn, as we see here and here, as the Smith family Laman does this. Now, nor would they include a double representation of Aries, which also appears in the Laman. Either chart form would have included Mercury as well, which is missing from the Laman. The horary chart is especially ruled out since the 1781 to 1782 timeframe predates the 1784 publication of Ebenezer Sibley's new and complete illustration of celestial sciences, from which other features of the Laman were directly copied. In short, the internal evidence proves that the Smith family Laman did not contain a nativity chart or a horary chart. Even if the Smith family Laman did reflect such a chart, it would be impossible to determine its true significance. Placing my isolation of the planet and zodiac figures side by side with the full Laman shows that the planets and zodiac figures were added to the Laman after the major magical figures were drawn. They just squeeze them in, fit as close to their intended location as possible, but within the constraints of the remaining open space. This destroys any possibility of calculating a precise date. Another explanation must exist for the inclusion of these figures. Working again from my isolation of the planetary and zodiac figures, I indicated which house, i.e., which triangular segment of zodiac these each fell into. The magician seems to have tried to redraw Aries closer to its own house. More importantly, the magician drew the figure for Saturn within two different houses. The answer to this mystery lies in the centuries-old practice of geomancy, which derives from geo, meaning earth, and mancy, meaning a system of divination. Geomancy, which had its roots in 7th century Islam, began with tossing sticks or stones to create random holes in the sand, but later shifted toward more casting lots. Works such as the 4th book of occult philosophy, John Hayden's 1664 Theomagicai, and Robert Cross Smith's 1825 Astrologer of the 19th Century instructed astrologers and magicians on this system. Geomantic castings created a set of random figures matching 16 recognized patterns. By one popular method, each of the 16 patterns was attributed to particular planets. The resulting planets were then arranged in the houses of a traditional astrological chart, allowing the magician to obtain insight regarding specific influences of the client's question. Astrological geomancy was thus a poor man's astrology, freed from the need to make complicated mathematical calculations. The geomantic house chart fulfilled all of the same functions as a horary chart, allowing the magician a method to answer their client's immediate questions. Notably, the process for creating a geomantic house chart allowed for planets to appear in more than one house. In fact, planets inevitably appeared in more than once in a geomantic chart, since there were more houses than there were geomantic figures, or than the planets at the time, rather. At the time, a planet could be entirely absent, its geomantic figure not having appeared in the casting of lots. As with the astronomical horary chart, the casting of a geomantic house chart seeks divination to a specific question. It's not possible to reverse engineer what the question was, given the squeezed-in position of the planets on the Smith family Laman. Some of their positions cannot be precisely determined to begin with. That said, the inclusion of a divinatory geomantic chart on the Smith Laman would suggest that the question had something to do with the purpose for which the Laman was created, that being the invocation of a spirit. Whatever the original question, the magician must have believed that the divinatory response was not only positive, but somehow enhancing the Laman's power. Mysterious characters. A final mystery has plagued those attempting to understand the Smith family Laman. Within the double border of the Laman on three sides, the magician repeated a string of characters that have never been deciphered. Quinn was unable to find a source for these characters, speculating they contained a substitution code for an unknown name. Based on the use of specialized alphabets to encode magical names in the Magus and elsewhere, this was not an unreasonable assumption. Others have proceeded on this same substitution code hypothesis, including Dan Vogel recently, who consulted with Joseph H. Peterson, a respected scholar of magical history and grimoires, to no avail. Having a somewhat larger network of academics and other specialists in the field of magical practice and history, I also contained several of my own expert contacts, none of which were able to decipher the inscription. One challenge with the substitution code hypothesis is that the number of characters in the inscription cannot be determined with any certainty. Quinn discerned 9 separate characters, while Vogel believed there were only 7. In my original investigation of the inscription, I too assumed a substitution code was used. One character, for example, closely resembles the Greek letter epsilon, which seems to encourage the substitution code hypothesis. In searching the Magus, I found 2 figures which resembled the I-shaped figure and the sideways S-shaped figure in the inscription. These, however, were simple descriptors for good spirits, representing perpendicular and separate. Consulting Fred Getting's exhaustive Dictionary of Occult, Hermetic, and Alchemical Sigils, I found the characters somewhat resembling a Jupiter symbol appeared as a signifier for steel in a 1701 lexicon, in a 13th century document, which would not likely have been available. I also searched Edmund Fry's Pantographia, a commonly available 1799 work containing over 200 then known alphabets, and found only limited resemblance to a few random letters. Based on my various attempts, I am convinced that these mysterious characters do not represent a simple substitution code. Dan Vogel recently announced his own speculation that the inscription consists of 7 characters, each representing one of the Chaldean planets. This approach has some merit, given that one character resembles the moon and another resembles a modern Jupiter symbol. Vogel's theory, which he was careful to qualify as pure conjecture, posited that the inscription was derived from a string of planetary symbols in a 1750 chapbook, the High German Fortune Teller. As Vogel demonstrated, these symbols varied considerably in subsequent other publications through 1827. While Vogel deserves praise for his deep research and innovative approach, there are problems with this hypothesis. First, the High German fortune teller characters are portrayed as part of a common charm to force a thief to return stolen goods. The text of this charm is important. Put down the minute when the goods were stolen and the planet ruling the day. So this done, put down the following characters on a fair piece of parchment. So turn around thrice, and if you hear no news of the thief in 24 hours, as 10 to 1 you will, prick the parchment full of holes and hang it up the chimney, where the heat of the fire may a little scorch it, and the thief will be so restless he will bring back the goods. The Smith Lawman, as explained earlier, does not reliably specify an exact date, let alone a minute. Further, the Smith Lawman is far more complex in its construction than the simple charm from the High German fortune teller. Vogel could argue that the magicians who constructed the Smith Lawman adapted characters at random, without regard for their context of thievery. This, however, would be at odds with the Lawman's otherwise careful and clearly intentional design. My own research and experience convinces me that nothing in the Smith Lawman was random. I believe that a more useful approach would be to consider this inscription within the context of its usage. Researchers might derive good direction from the title of Vogel's presentation video, Joseph Smith the Necromancer. Interestingly, Joseph Smith's uncle Jesse Smith discussed his nephew in 1829 and accused him of obtaining the golden plates by necromancy, only later claiming that an angel had revealed the location with a promise of great wealth, gold and silver, and precious stones, that he would have dominion over all the land of Palmyra. Necromancy stems from necro meaning dead and mancy meaning divination, hence divination by means of the dead. And notwithstanding lurid tales of raising corpses from the grave, the vast majority of necromancy involved invoking the shades or spirits of the dead in order to obtain information. While some of the detailed rituals of necromancy differed between various sources, the wearing of a lawman has been a consistent part of the ceremony. The lawman contains images intended to protect the wearer from the potential risks of necromancy. Sibley wrote that while a magician could certainly call forth spirits of the dead and bind them without any evil influences, safeguards were called for. Too often, he suggested, an officious attitude could lead the magician to enter into unholy contracts. This helps to explain why the Smith family Laman is predominantly filled with protective elements. The Laman's elements to attract and invoke a spirit, on the other hand, seem to be relatively few at first glance. The border, with its versicle and band, seemed of divine names, served its double purpose as we already described. The Sibley seal was included, causing all spirits to pay homage to the magician. The pentagram was drawn in each corner. The central star was added, which according to the Magus should contain the name and character of the star or of the spirit his governor, to whom this good spirit that is called is subject. This latter figure, understood properly, might be good-naturedly thought of as the magician's version of being a Karen, calling the manager in order to obtain desired services from subordinates. Good measure, the magician added multiple angelic and divine names to this latter figure, drawing again on authority to command a target spirit. The observant viewer might notice by now that every element of the Smith family Laman thus far relies upon just three sources. Francis Barrett's The Magus, published in 1801, Ebenezer Sibley's new and complete illustration of the celestial sciences, published in multiple editions beginning in 1884, and Robert Cross Smith's Astrologer of the 19th Century, published in 1825. These are all from my own collection. All three of these volumes, as noted by Quinn, were available in the New England of Joseph Smith's time. Even the most rare of these, the Magus, has already been firmly established as an influence on Joseph Smith. This suggests that if we look primarily to these sources in order to understand the thrice repeated mysterious characters of the Smith family Laman. Francis Barrett included a small section of the Magus, which was allegedly constructed and composed by Johannes Trithemius, a Benedictine abbot and occultist whose lifespan bridged the 15th and 16th centuries in Germany. This section of the Magus added condensed specific instructions on how to conjure spirits to visible appearance. With regard to the use of a Laman in this ritual, Trithemius directed the aspiring magician to hang the pentacle around thy neck. For added clarity, Trithemius provided helpful drawings of each tool used in the conjuration, including the pentacle or Laman. This example provided the same basic requirements as described elsewhere in the Magus. The Laman is intended here to aid the magician in conjuring Michael the archangel, who as an archangel had no other superior spirits to call upon as influence. First, Michael's name is done in both English and in Hebrew. Finally, the center of the star contains the sigil of Michael. A spirit's name or sigil was typically written 3 times in any Laman intended to summon them. Each time it was written in a different language or alphabet, the latter of which the Magus helpfully provided several. The sigil, however, was something different and special. The sigil was a figurative drawing unique to every spirit. One might readily notice that the sigil has no relationship to known human languages, but rather seems like an almost random shape and appearance. It cannot be translated, nor is it a substitution code. For certain well-established spirits who had a long history of working with magicians, sigils were known and provided in books such as the Magus. Knowing a spirit's true name, as reflected in their sigil, was a key to obtaining that spirit's cooperation in the future. For other spirits, however, such as spirits of the dead that one might conjure in an act of necromancy, it was up to the magician to obtain a sigil directly from the spirit in question. Once this was obtained through a pact with the spirit, the magician had the option of calling upon that spirit at future times with a much abbreviated ritual. Looking back on the Smith Laman, the only name written in English is Raphael, whose name is also written in Hebrew. The sigil of Raphael, however, is absent, despite being readily available in the Magus and other works. Therefore, the magician clearly regarded Raphael as a superior to some other spirit who was the intended target of this Laman. Based on magical texts which form the source of the Smith Laman, and with the practical view of a magician using those texts, there's only one reasonable explanation for the thrice repeated mysterious characters. The magician who constructed the Smith family Laman intended to summon a spirit with whom they had already communicated. a spirit who had provided their sigil and agreed to return to the magician when called upon by this in the future. I wish to be cautious in attempting to identify this spirit. The lawman was evidently in the possession of Hiram Smith when he and Joseph Smith were murdered, and it was passed down through his descendants. That said, it was Joseph Smith Jr. who told of interactions with multiple spiritual messengers. It was Joseph who died with a Jupiter talisman on his person, copied directly from the Magus. Joseph's connections with the spirit of conjuring treasure guardian spirits are well documented. I'm not particularly disposed to believe Joseph's religious claims. The specific details of his encounters with Moroni, however, suggest to me, as a practitioner of ceremonial magic, that his story should not be dismissed as mere fancy. Disregarded by many, the Smith family may well, in fact, be the earliest known artifact uniquely and exclusively tied with Mormonism. In this precious artifact, carefully handed down through the Smith family, I suspect that we see the sigil of the spirit Joseph called upon as he made his yearly visits to Cumorah. In offering this research, I see in my mind's eye my brother magician on the night of the fall equinox in 1827. He knows the rites of necromancy by which a man can commune with angels, demons, and the spirits of the dead. Perhaps he's fasted a few days and washed himself. As his father later told Willard Chase, he dressed himself with great care and solemnity in a suit of black clothing, and fit out a black horse he had borrowed from a friend. Reaching the hill, he climbs in silence. He once again reaches the spot he knows so well, and quietly uses his sword or dagger to draw a circle on the ground with sacred names and images. Following the old magical books, he hangs a leather pouch around his neck containing a lamen that has been carefully drawn and properly consecrated. He stands within the circle, declaring authority in the divine names of Adonai and Tetragrammaton. He calls forth the spirit whose sigil adorns his lamen and demands custody of the treasure, a book engraved on gold plates. Successful in his quest, he takes the treasure and quickly descends the hill, being careful not to look back at the burial space. What happened beyond that, only my brother Joseph knows for sure. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Will you entertain questions? We have time for a
Absolutely.
couple, I think. Thank you so much. We appreciate that.
Okay. I did not look at the chat while I was speaking, so
Well done, Nick.
thank you.
Hmm.
Clinton asks, which spirits were governed by Raphael? Any spirits associated with the planet Mercury or with the god Mercury. There's not a definitive list in that sense. And in fact, any spirit that you conjured might reveal its nature as to what planetary influence or what spiritual influence governed it. So unfortunately, we can't just say, okay, it's Raphael. Here's our directory.
So one of the things you suggest as a supposition, right, is that this could have been a sigil of Moroni. Is there any reason why Joseph might have thought that Moroni was ruled over by Raphael or anything like that? One of the questions I thought.
Well, Mercury is all about communication. Mercury is related to Thoth, Odin, Hermes. Mercury is in particular a god of writing.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes a rather interesting association for a book engraved on golden plates. Also, you can link this to the myths of Hermes Trismegistus, who engraved his knowledge on golden plates. So just off the top of my head, that we have those kind of associations.
Thank you, Nick.
Absolutely. Let's see. Just checking out here what else is in the. Why would quadrant 12 be empty? Again, a good question. And again, it's because of the fact that they had already placed the major magical figures in the Laman. And then they took the astronomical and planetary figures and squeezed them in the blank spots wherever there was room for them. So many of them are not going to be exactly where they were in the reading. They're going to be as close as they could get them. Let's see.
I just asked a little question there toward the bottom about the possibility of any overlap with the characters document and that particular sigil.
I have also played with that, and there just isn't.
Okay, okay, thank you.
You know, that was definitely one of my approaches, and yeah, it's just the idea of a substitution cipher simply does not play out.
Okay. So Nathan Hadfield is asking where the questions are being posted, and the answer is in chat. Nathan, would you like to ask a question? Okay, he says no. Does anyone else have a question? This is, I mean, this, what you've done here in my mind is, I mean, it's just mind blowing. Because you are really, you know, you have nailed this document in a way that, you know, everyone up to now has failed to do, and it's a very convincing argument. So I'm just really beside myself with excitement here. And I think, you know, your experience as a practitioner is absolutely crucial in reaching this perspective that, you know, so many other people who've come at this problem, you know, very intelligent people, great scholars, but, you know, alas, they're not practitioners, and, you know, they wouldn't really know about the use of these documents, how they're actually used. It's a great liability for them. So is there anything you could tell us about approaching this as a practitioner just generally?
Sure. So as I mentioned toward the beginning of my paper, um, you know, I began looking at grimoires, particularly the Magus, early on, like as soon as Quinn's book came out, and that came out in '89, the first version. And through that time, you know, like from that time until now, I've almost always had a copy of the Magus. For a long time, it was the cheap $15 paperback reprint that you can order on Amazon. And I've gradually collected my way up to where I now have an original 1801, which are very rare. When I first tried to read the Magus and understand all these images and all these details in it, it was confusing. It was just impenetrable. And it wasn't until I actually began learning and practicing ceremonial magic with the help of other magicians and you know, really tutoring, if you will, that I coming back to those documents, I was able to say, oh, this is really clear. You know, Carl Jung had a similar experience, I found out later, because he did a great deal of work on alchemy. And he also said that when he first began looking at alchemical manuscripts, they were just a mass of confusion to him. And it was only later, after he came to his own realizations of what's going on, that all of a sudden, you know, they were suddenly an open book. This, you could relate that in some ways, honestly, to some things that Joseph said about the Book of Mormon itself, as far as things being made plain. So, for example, when you look at Quinn, and please don't take any disrespect for Quinn, because, you know, I think we all have huge regard for him and his work. But there are places that he can read the documents, and any historian can read the documents, but that doesn't mean they understand the context and the culture and the meaning of the documents. So there are places where Quinn was dead on correct. There are places where Quinn misunderstood what he was reading. And there are places where the same passages he's reading actually revealed much bigger things than he realized to include, simply because of this lack of context. Similar thing, this is really similar to the work that Joe Steve Swick and Cheryl Bruno and I did on Method Infinite, coming to that as for the first time as scholars with experience in both Mormonism and Freemasonry, instead of with just one tradition or the other. We were able to see things and understand what we were looking at in the sources in a different way than historians without that experience had done in the past. So I'm trying to bring a practitioner's perspective, as I said, to open up the mystery.
Yeah.
Because here, this is something that is not going to be understood just by looking at a copy of the Magus without context.
Yeah.
But once you do understand what is being explained, this is what, the light bulb comes on. This is what the inscription has to be. It's the only logical thing.
Yeah.
In practical terms. If it's not a sigil of the spirit that the lawman is targeted at, then it is completely random scribbling, and that's out of character for anything else on the lawman.
Exactly.